Welcome to the Fax Machine. My name is Rob, and I'm here with my co-hosts Noah.
Hello.
And Emily.
Sup?
And we're ready to get wild. This week's theme is the Wild West, and our episode will be more sultry than Mae West, crazier than Kanye West, and attempt even more puns than Adam West's Batman.
Nice.
So follow us down this perilous path to the frontier America. Marvel at the amber waves of grain, the purple mountain majesty, and of course, the fruited plain. And on this journey, we will each share a fact that we learned this week about the Wild West. Our facts will be followed at the end by a pub-style trivia quiz, loosely inspired by the theme. Also, a reminder to our listeners, details are forthcoming of our fabled live show.
Ooh, details.
We went for very different vibes there.
Yeah, we did.
I was like, woo! And you were like,
A
woo!
little haunting. Yeah, it's all right.
Both woos, so...
Yeah, in our own way.
And before we get started, just a reminder to check out our social media accounts on Instagram and Twitter at FaxMachinePod and on Facebook at FaxMachinePodcast. And with that, we'll begin today's podcast with Noah.
This week I learned, every year since 2012, the Willamette Historical Society in Oregon hosts Oregon Trail Live, an educational reenactment of the challenges of life on the trail, including wagon caulking, hunting with Nerf guns, and a three-legged dysentery race.
Oh, no.
We'll get into that later.
Dysentery should never be a race.
So, as many of you may know, the Oregon Trail is a roughly 2,200-mile-long wagon route that connected Missouri to Oregon, and on the way spanned Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho also. So fur traders actually established the trail between 1811 and 1840, with the first wagon train leaving Independence, Missouri in 1836. Many of these fur traders, interestingly, worked for the Pacific Fur Company, which was a subsidiary of the American Fur Company, which was owned by John Jacob Astor, the namesake of such New York neighborhoods as Astor Place and Astoria, as well as the city of Astoria, Oregon, at the other end of the trail.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty cool.
That's pretty cool.
I wish I'd found that out for our New York episode,
Yeah.
but instead it'll be in this one. Early groups of travelers included the Oregon Dragoons, who carried a large flag that was emblazoned with their motto, Oregon or the grave, which was a promise that the many dangers on the journey were happy to oblige. So from 1836 until 1843, most of the parties were pretty small, no more than a few families. And then came the Great Migration of 1843, when somewhere between 700 to 1,000 travelers left for Oregon, led by a former U.S. Army captain who charged $1 per person. Now, this makes it sound like it was pretty cheap, but actually, the cost for an average person to travel the Oregon Trail ranged anywhere from absolutely nothing. Maybe they signed on to sort of help herd cattle, and their wages were basically what it cost to get them from, say, Missouri all the way to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Or it could cost hundreds of dollars by hiring somebody to help them navigate the treacherous trail and get all the way there.
Wow.
Most of the danger that people who were on this trail faced were from disease, and I think it was somewhere about 3% of all travelers died of cholera, with many other diseases claiming for their lives. And I think that the total dead was in the tens of thousands. I think between 10 and 20,000.
Wow. So all these people heading out to Oregon reminds me of accounts that I've seen of people just having no idea what they were getting into. There are people who made a living out of going 5 miles into the Oregon Trail and then picking up all the things that people had brought that were completely impractical, like portraits and grandfather clocks and things that were just absurd to try to bring to Oregon, but no one had told them. It's so sad that so many people died, but there was just really bad PR.
People brought grandfather clocks.
People brought their worldly possessions as if they were just gonna plop down a new house in Oregon.
Just from all the stuff from their old house.
Whatever used to be there.
Okay. So wait, so these possessions were found in abandoned wagons because people didn't make the trip, or were they just kind of
No, they were
tossed
found
out en route we don't have space for this
10 miles west of St. Louis was just a stack of stuff. And people were like, wait a minute.
Yeah, but I mean, of those who actually made it, the people who settled at the end of the Oregon Trail, which was in Willamette Valley, one of the big issues was how do you organize the land claims of all these people who are arriving, basically under the impression that they can go there and just get a plot of incredibly fertile, beautiful land, which it was very beautiful there. So when all these people are arriving in the Willamette Valley, they had to find some way of organizing them. And I read about this. And it was pretty interesting. It was called the Organic Laws of Oregon, which I thought sounded like something that could have been drafted in Oregon today. Like all food in Oregon must be organic. But it's actually something from around this time, the 40s or something. So one of the ways that they tried to organize land claims was by giving special treatment to married couples. So a married couple could go and get about, I think it's 640 acres of land, basically at no cost, provided that they demonstrated they planned to improve the land or build on it, etc. If you were a single person, you could go there, I think especially if you were a male single person, you could go there and get 320 acres of land. And I'm not sure how I see that that's more, per person. Because they made a big deal out of you getting more if you're a married couple, or it being some special deal. But it was 640. And then if you went there as a single person, I think it was 320. But I think, that's half.
Yeah.
Well, see, it's more because when you're married as a woman back then, they actually considered you a person. So then you got as much as a single man would.
Right.
Maybe that's what it is.
So I guess it's a married man got twice as much land. Maybe that's it.
That's actually,
interesting.
That's it. No, I'm more depressed now. Anyways, carry on.
But anyway, so it's there in the Willamette Valley that we come to the originators of our fact, the Willamette Historical Society, who in honor of the Oregon Trail put on what appears to be an absolutely awesome educational festival every year called Oregon Trail Live, where the motto is, quote, "You've played the video game, but can you survive the real thing?" And
so Oregon decidedly less fun. Any game that includes the phrase "survive," but I'll keep an open mind.
I'm picturing a very role models kind of thing. Have you ever seen the movie Role Models?
No.
Oh, it's bad.
Selling it really well.
Well, let's see how you feel after I explain to you some of the challenges. So, at Oregon Trail Live, teams compete in challenges such as the three-legged dysentery race. I mentioned that before. It took me a lot of researching to figure out what the deal with this is. Because, the three-legged dysentery race, it's, two people, obviously their leg is tied together. It's just a three-legged race. What's the dysentery part of it? And I read a couple articles and I couldn't figure out what precisely was the point of this. Why were they running? And I think closest I got was the point was it's you running sort of a little off balance to an outhouse.
Oh, see, I was thinking it's another form of having the runs.
Oh. That could definitely be it.
That makes sense.
I thought, I read it some reference to you're running toward an outhouse. But that makes so much more sense.
It could be both.
All right.
I'll check that one off the list. Now I understand
that.
It's pretty clear, though, why it's not a sack race, because then you wouldn't have to run to the outhouse.
That's for the elephantitis race. Don't look that up. Okay. Another really great one is so some of these challenges come from the game. In the game, you had to carry game meat. I don't know if you remember that. So one of the things it was you had to drag a 200-pound man in a cow costume in a wagon up a hill. And we'll post on Instagram. There are some amazing pictures from the Oregon Trail Live Facebook group about this. Where it's just a guy in a cow onesie, and he's just sitting in a wagon, just having the time of his life, and it looks incredible. Another great one is there's a station where you bury your ill-fated team member. And this is actually portrayed by a paper doll that they give you. But there's a priest on call to help you out and give a funeral. And then there's also a gravestone making station. And I saw one looking through, again, the Oregon Trail Live Facebook group, which is great. They have hundreds of pictures from the events. And it was one for Pee Wee Herman. I don't know why they decided to pick on Pee Wee Herman. But it said it was here lies Pee Wee Herman. He died of cholera, dysentery, and bad life choices. And it was it's obviously written by a child. Like, it's just very, very weird. So another one says R.I.P. and then below that, rest in peace. It's like, why did you abbreviate it?
Just to break it down.
And it says,
those were his initials.
Yeah.
R.I.P. Van Winkle.
Some of them are like, in the background of this picture, Uncle Bob, thanks for the money, 1800 to 1850. And then Phineas Bix was a simple man who owed plenty pennies to banker man, repaid his debt on the Oregon Trail, found a snake in his boot, and his heart did fail.
Wow.
Jeez.
And what's kind of funny about all these is that there actually probably weren't that many gravestones on the Oregon Trail. I mean, maybe a few, but it was actually a very common practice to bury people in unmarked graves, and not just to dig a hole and throw someone in it without like any marker, but also to camouflage the grave and like run wagons over it a lot so it didn't look like it was a grave at all, like pack the earth down. And that was so for a couple of things. One, that like animals wouldn't come by and dig up the bodies, and secondly, sort of to your point from before, like bandits and people would come take things that might be buried with people.
Oh.
Right.
Yeah. So another thing that I'm obsessed with. I desperately want to go to this event, and it's in September every year, so sometime we should go. So one of these things is you can get a drink at Miss Millie's Saloon, Dance Hall, Gambling Den, and Arm Wrestling Emporium. And appropriately for this podcast, the entire competition ends with a, quote, homesteader's exam, in which the teams answer historical trivia questions about the real Oregon Trail. And in an article about Oregon Trail Live, Willamette Heritage Center Education Coordinator Kathleen Schultz added that she served as the sheriff for the first edition of the games and said that everybody is bribable for the information. I got 2 pennies from the future and a raspberry granola bar for helping a team pass.
2 pennies from the future.
That was emphasis added. Just so
this makes me think about, obviously, Oregon Trail, the video game, which I clearly played for much of my childhood. And I don't know if we've talked about it here, but it has a really cool origin story.
Yeah.
It was an elementary school teacher who was given 2 weeks to design a curriculum for his class that was studying like Frontier America.
I'm sorry, he was actually a high school teacher. I'm sorry, he was a high school student who was a student teacher at an elementary school in 1971, yeah. And so that was like part of his project, is he and another student teacher, they were high school students, built this game together. Sorry, go on and tell this story that I'm telling.
No, because like I wanted to just pay homage to the fact that he did that and then basically deleted it when they were done with the project, and then he got a job working at the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, where they were like, oh, why don't you build that? That sounded really cool. And he said he actually took the time to research the things he'd built into the game the first time, and to like make it more accurate. And it became this like very well-selling game, and it may still be the best-selling educational computer game in America.
Really? What about Carmen Sandiego?
That's a good question. I don't know.
You know what? I'll edit it out.
But
not good enough to stay in.
But so what caught my attention was a line on the Wikipedia page for the game that said it is was to a point the best-selling educational game in the U.S. and is the only educational video game in the Video Game Hall of Fame.
Oh, wow.
And I said, the what? And so I looked for the Video Game Hall of Fame, where I found... Awesome. In 2015, they had the inaugural class of video games to be inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Oh, as late as 2015.
That was the first
I'm actually
year.
surprised it wasn't much earlier.
Yeah. And so there are 12 games, I believe, currently in it now, 6 of which were in the inaugural class. Mm-hmm. And so those original 6 that made it in were Doom, Pac-Man, Pong, Super Mario Brothers, Tetris, and World of Warcraft. Which is interesting. World of Warcraft was 11 years old at the time of that inauguration. More surprisingly, though, Minecraft, which was only 4 years old, was in that class of nominees.
Wow.
So there's a bunch of other games.
It didn't make it in that round.
Didn't make it. Oregon Trail was in the first kind of nomination. Did not make it. Angry Birds, Legends of Zelda, Sims, those were all in that first nomination class. Oregon Trail got its day in the sun in 2016 in the second class, so it was in the second wave of games. Among the top 10 to be brought into the Hall of Fame, along with Legend of Zelda, well-deserved, Sonic the Hedgehog, Space Invaders, and The Sims. And then one game that hadn't been nominated the year before, Grand Theft Auto 3. Clearly the best. And then...
Well, you know it's the best because they stopped making them after that.
No. But yeah, so it's interesting to watch the progression of games as they get nominated into this Hall of Fame. They've become very selective. So last year they brought in in 2017 I should say, they brought in Pokemon Red and Blue as one unit, because it is basically the same game, but they made you buy both. Bastards. Street Fighter 2, Donkey Kong, and Halo Combat Evolved.
Cool.
And so basically with every passing year, I know less and less of the games. So I believe the physical embodiment of the Hall of Fame is in the History Museum, the Strong, in Rochester, New York. So if you ever want to stop in and see, I don't know, probably all the stuff that's in my basement, like, you can go there too.
Is that your pickup line, Rob?
You can either come to my basement or go to Rochester.
So in relation to your fact, I kind of looked into sort of other efforts towards building replicas or kind of performing reenactments of life in the Wild West. And I have to say, there's quite a market and also, like, substantial level of enthusiasm and participation in reenacting Wild West towns. Not only in terms of like maintaining ghost towns, but even building up replica towns from scratch. Ooh. And it's not limited to the US either. I found a couple of examples of amusement park type places in Germany. There's a pretty intense replica Wild West town in Kent, England called Laredo. But a few of
Laredo is a real city in Texas, yeah.
Whoa! Well, there you go. Very authentic then.
Yeah.
But a few of my favorite examples that I stumbled upon are actually in the U.S. So there's one of them that was built in California that was actually put up for sale for $950K in 2015. And I did some digging into it more recently. Per Realtor.com, it was never sold, and it was now it's off the market, but it is valued at a cool $411K.
Wow.
And per the listing has, in quotes, plenty of storage. So it could be the time to pounce if anybody's in the market
That's
for
awesome. I feel
a replica Wild West town.
Aren't there a lot of towns like that were movie sets that they built specifically for movie sets, like in
And that
the
got
old,
left
like
over?
Western
Ooh.
movie days? I think so. I mean, I think that some of them may just have been on studio lots, but I also think that they definitely built up. And it'd be things like where like the main street, like look, if you were standing in the main, in the main street, you would look around, it would be like a bunch of stores and everything would look normal, but it's actually just like the store fronts, and they would be like on stilts kind of behind them, and they would build these like sort of sprawling downtown areas where if you're walking on the street, everything would look like you were actually in some sort of frontier dusty town.
Wow.
Right, but the actual buildings themselves were vacant or not?
Didn't exist. It was just the front wall.
Facades.
Yeah, exactly, the
Okay.
facades. Thank you.
I feel like that's such a Cecil B. DeMille thing, to just build a whole town in the middle of nowhere and then just leave it there when he's done with it.
Like, all right, I'm set. Another example that I stumbled upon was constructed by billionaire Wild Bill Koch, whose last name might sound familiar.
Yeah, it's the Koch brothers' dad, right?
No, one of the lesser known Koch brothers. The wild one. But yeah, his town has 50 buildings, and it's in Colorado. And he basically built it because he's a Wild West aficionado, hence his nickname, and has that kind of money. And
aficionado is a funny word for fetishist.
He also partly built this town to house the various knickknacks and tchotchkes from the Wild West that he's acquired over the years, including, to list a few, Jesse James's gun, Wyatt Earp's vest, Sitting Bull's rifle, and a flag that belonged to General George Custer. So he has quite the assortment. Also completely unrelated to Wild West towns, but actually somewhat related to Noah, the resident Texan of the Fax Machine podcast.
Okay.
Wear it proud.
There you go. So I found this just spontaneously in a Quartz article.
In a what?
An article on quartz.
Okay. Sorry, I get it. Okay.
Not like made of the of the geos.
It's like chiseled into
just tripped over it on my way to work. And was like,
now.
What does it say in this quartz? So presumably inspired by the chaotic, kind of lawless connotations of the Wild West, apparently a Norwegian colloquial phrase to describe something as crazy is, and I apologize in advance for butchering this, det helt Texas, or that's totally Texas.
All right, Emily, what have you got for us?
This week I learned that thanks to an initiative by the U.S. Army, camels, alongside the deer and the antelope and the buffalo, once had a home on the range.
Oh.
Yeah. So before I dive into this further, I should note that camels are actually no stranger to the North American continent, dating back long before the Wild West. Their earliest ancestors actually lived here some 40 to 50 million years ago during the Eocene period, and the last camel native to North America, Camelops histernus, went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, along with all sorts of other megafauna like mastodons and ground sloths and saber-toothed cats. Unlike their ancestors, the camels that I'm talking about in this fact, the ones that roamed the Wild West, were not native to the Americas, but rather imported here by the United States Camel Corps, a branch of the military whose tenure spanned 10 years in the mid-19th century, and whose objective was to see if camels, which in theory would be well adapted for the desert-like climate of the newly settled American Southwest, could be trained as pack animals and used in military operations. So, at the time of the Camel Corps' inception, American settlers were migrating across the country to settle what would become the Wild West. And as we know from the Oregon Trail and Noah's Fact, that trip was long and grueling, particularly for the pack animals that were tasked with pulling wagons full of aspiring frontierspeople and all their crap. Horses and mules aren't really designed for traveling those kinds of distances, especially in hot, dry conditions with infrequent stops for water, so a lot of times they actually died of dehydration en route.
I don't mean to pull you up on that, but Emily, horses and mules aren't designed at all. There's no God! I'm wearing a shirt that says Viva la Evolucion.
My question is, are camels domesticated, like exclusively domesticated animals, or are there wild camels in the world?
Actually, yes, there are wild camels in the world, and they live in southern Mongolia, northern China, and the Gobi Desert. They had previously been thought to be escaped Bactrian camels that had been domesticated and then went feral, but they're actually recently, through like genetic analysis, were found to be a separate population that lived alongside or in a similar area as the original population that was domesticated. And there are some places in the world where that sort of feral situation did happen, very notably in Australia. There's a huge number of feral camels just like were wandering the Australian outback.
But not in America.
Well, there were until the middle of the last century, supposedly, by some eyewitness accounts.
Yes, apparently they all escaped into Texas. And at least until I think in the 1900s, somewhere in there, they were eventually hunted down and people haven't seen them.
Because they're hiding. People are hunting.
But if you go along the shores of the Rio Grande and listen at night, you some people report hearing the sounds of a camel snuffling or whatever
Could
camels
you mimic
do.
What is the sound of
the
a
sonorous...
You can hear the camels humping.
The camel's cold. Camel jokes.
Camel jokes. Hashtag camel jokes.
Guys.
Do you guys know what's inside camel humps?
Fat.
Yeah, it's fat. And a lot of people think it's water. But those people forget that camels are not cactuses.
That's the key difference.
Yeah, I would say there's a major difference. And one of them is that they're...
If there's one thing to learn from this episode, it's that cactuses, not the same thing.
Not the same.
Oh yeah, so given that horses and mules, not amazing at what we were asking them to do, a few majors proposed a potential solution to this issue, and their initiative was essentially to introduce camels to the U.S. and adapt them to the jobs that we were having these horses and mules do. This initiative actually caught the attention and support of a certain senator from Mississippi by the name of Jefferson Davis.
Boo.
Yeah.
Pro or anti?
I'm hoping there's a consensus on that by now. But
I think Rob was asking whether he was for or against camels. No, the podcast is against Jefferson Davis.
Only time will tell.
I think we've been pretty clear on that issue.
No, he was in support. He was a member of the pro-camel lobby,
Okay.
which is an actual phrase that I encountered quite a bit in my reading. But yeah, so upon Jefferson Davis's appointment as Secretary of War, he presented this proposal to Congress as an opportunity to improve transportation in the expanding Southwest. And Congress approved the project, and Henry Wayne, a major who was kind of one of the initial proponents, was actually tasked with getting a bunch of camels So he boarded a ship called the USS Supply, which stopped in Tunisia, Greece, Egypt, and Turkey, and picked up 33 camels and 5 camel drivers in its journey. The camels themselves were a mix of dromedary and Bactrian, which are like the 2 major varieties, as well as one Boogdi, which is apparently a mix between, or the progeny rather, of a male Bactrian and a female dromedary. But after another one of these camel collecting trips, the Camel Station, as it was called, of the Camel Corps was established in Camp Verde, Texas, and housed some 70 camels. So the first experiment that was done to assess the potential of camels as ships of the desert, as they were called, was in 1857 when a herd of 25 of them were sent off in a mission to sort of survey a wagon road that would run between a fort in New Mexico and the border of modern-day Arizona and California. I should note that the route they followed and scouted is actually the modern-day route of Route 66. So thanks to those camels for doing a good job surveying. Unsurprisingly, the camels knocked their mission out of the park, carrying way more weight apiece than any mule or horse ever could. So these guys could handle up to 700 pounds, where a strong mule could take about half of that at the most. They can travel for 30 to 40 miles a day. And this trip total was over 1,000 miles. So I dare say, like the Proclaimers, these critters would walk 500 miles and 500 more. I Googled the length of that journey in hopes that I could make that joke. And I'm still very pleased if I could. And they could go without stopping for water for a week, if not over that. So basically, the contest between camels versus traditional pack animals was no contest at all. So much so that Henry Wayne wrote to his friend, "I believe at this time I may speak for every man in our party when I say that there is not one of them who would prefer the most indifferent of our camels to 4 of our best mules." So,
where are the camels now?
An excellent question. So basically, despite the promise that camels clearly demonstrated, and the fact that they completed many more of these surveying missions and were also used to just transport dried goods and even mail briefly, somewhat of a complicated thing happened around the time that their sort of use was just beginning to be explored, called the Civil War. So
it's amazing Jefferson Davis had so much time to spend on this whole camel thing.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So unsurprisingly, his association with the Camel Corps was actually part of the reason why it was dropped, because he wasn't making many friends during the Civil War, and the Union Congress was not about to support anything that he had once backed.
Wow, yeah.
So that was part of why the Camel Corps kind of fell to the wayside.
Oh, man.
But basically, yeah. So what happened was, with the end of the Camel Corps, Camp Verde shut down, and the army opted to sell the remaining camels to a variety of people, private citizens, butchers who jerkied them, sadly, various mining and prospecting companies, even railroad companies. They actually helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad in Arizona. Zoos, and also, I guess unsurprisingly, the Ringling Brothers Circus.
Yeah.
But there are also quite a few of them that were simply released into the wilderness. And actually, those that were set free were spotted. Actually, those that were set free were spotted roaming the deserts in herds as late as the mid-20th century. And as you can imagine, that gave rise to some pretty interesting lore and urban legends by people who spotted them and were like, "The fuck is that?" So, to share 2 of my favorite anecdotes. So there's an urban legend that arose in the 1880s in the Arizona Territory about the Red Ghost. This legend involves sightings of a 30-foot-tall red-haired creature, and eyewitness accounts sort of describe the creature as devilish-looking, as many urban legendy creatures are described. But yeah, so essentially it was a camel with a dead rider strapped to it, so gross.
Wow, yeah.
And in a later sighting, someone actually shot at it, and it got away, but left behind a human skull that fell off. So yeah, I honestly feel bad for the camel. So that's the Red Ghost. That's a creepy one. But the second story is much more heartwarming. So the last well-documented and confirmed camel sighting of one of these camels was actually a camel named Topsy. And she was seen by many people as she was a celebrity at the Griffith Park Zoo in Los Angeles.
Oh, nice.
So she lived to be 81 years old, and over the course of her illustrious life, so she was one of the first camels that came over in that original trip on the USS Supply. She was thought to have actually completed that initial initial kind of pilot journey that I mentioned earlier as well. She also worked in a mine, performed with the Ringling Brothers, and even hit the silver screen a couple of times.
Yeah, I was going to say, I bet she went to L.A. to pursue a career in acting because she was a dromedary.
Very nice, very nice.
That was excellent.
I actually encountered another kind of interesting tangent just in researching this story. So there is a sincere interest in reviving the efforts of the U.S. Camel Corps in some respects, but for a very different purpose than what it was originally designed for. So actually, efforts to bring camels to the U.S. have been more recently proposed by ecologists.
Ooh.
Yeah. So this comes from the concept and conservation of Pleistocene rewilding, which basically entails introducing the modern-day relatives of extinct megafauna to the areas that were once inhabited by their ancestors, and in order to sort of refill the niches that their ancestors used to occupy, and in doing so, rebalance their ecosystems and kind of restore biodiversity. So the idea behind this is that a lot of these megafauna were at or at least near the top of their food chains and were major predators in these environments. So now issues that are frequent, like sort of overpopulation of deer in national parks, that results in them having to actually be hunted to keep their numbers down to an appropriate degree, that could be remedied by reintroducing megafauna and sort of trying to reestablish the conditions in which these ecosystems originally evolved. There are some actually sort of active, or at the very least planned, projects to kind of attempt these initiatives. To clarify, they sort of would occur in sort of controlled, contained scenarios. So we wouldn't like import a bunch of lions and just release them all over the United States or something like that. But it would be sort of in an enclosed, larger space, kind of reintroduce them to the ecosystem and see what happens. But a few efforts around the world that kind of are based upon this principle include the Randers Rainforest Zoo in Denmark has the plan to introduce a population of Asian elephants. The Australian Rhino Project is actually already ongoing. And this one is kind of cool in that it also includes the facet of conservation, basically with the idea of taking a species that's already on the brink of extinction and sort of trying to conserve it in a place apart from where it originates. So conserving rhinos by trying to see if they can do well in Australia as they're going extinct in Africa. And a modern example of sort of fortuitous or unintentional rewilding that I stumbled upon and couldn't resist talking about are Pablo Escobar's cocaine hippos.
Wait.
Does this ring a bell? They are not hippos constructed from cocaine, to put that out there. So that would be pretty magnificent. And basically, Pablo Escobar, with his mountains of cocaine-derived money from his mountains of cocaine, basically built himself this huge, expansive, luxurious estate and filled it with all sorts of wild, exotic animals, including hippos. And after he died, they just kind of, some of them escaped into the wild and proliferated really effectively.
Where was it?
In Colombia.
In Colombia, okay.
And they're still there. So now there's sort of an issue in Colombia of whether these hippos should be hunted and removed.
These dang hippos are everywhere.
Dang hippos are everywhere. But yeah, so there's kind of a sort of discussion happening right now with the Colombian government and also ecologists who are actually advocating for leaving this growing population of cocaine hippos alone to see if they might have some beneficial effects on the environment.
I think maybe a rebranding effort might help.
Yeah,
these cocaine hippos. Oh, Pablo Escobar's cocaine.
Yeah. Like they come in for a job and they're like, "Oh, what's your resume?" It's like, "Well, I'm a hippopotamus from Colombia." And like, "Oh, you're a cocaine hippo." You're never getting the job.
I'm trying to leave that life behind. Just want a fresh start.
So, if we have a second, I had just one touch point of camel-type animals in the United States. And so camels are in a kind of bigger family of camelids, which includes llamas, alpacas, and vicuñas, kind of the American camelid species. And I worked in spinal research for my PhD. And I remember going to a conference and walking around and looking at all the posters and all the science that all the other smart people were doing that was better than mine. And
it's like other smart people.
Too real.
All the smart people around me. But I found there's a gentleman who went to Brigham Young University.
Ooh, a gentleman.
Wow.
He was an adult. But I met this grad student, and he was had a poster on his research, and it was roughly entitled "Biomechanical Analysis of Camelid Cervical Intervertebral Discs," which is everything that I study except for the camelid part.
Was it roughly titled that, or did you just read the title of it?
So that's the name
precise.
of his paper in the Journal of Orthopedic Translational Medicine.
Oh,
so I don't know what the poster was called. It must have been close.
okay, I see.
But I remember looking at it and being like, oh, I do biomechanical analysis of intervertebral discs, but what are the camels? And so I literally just looked at him and said, you have camels? And he said, excuse me, what? And I was
How
like,
did you get in here? You're not one of us smart gentlemen from BYU.
but so I found this really fascinating. The neck of a camel, or the cervical spine of camels, and specifically of things like llamas that have very elongated necks, it has a curvature that goes out in the front and then back up, which mimics the human spine really well. And so using the lower part of the cervical spine of a camel in the neck is the same kind of loading pattern that you would see in a human lumbar spine, which is very hard to get to. And so they used it as a model of loading and degeneration. And so in Utah, there were literally just farms full of alpaca that grad students would go to and do all these tests and like bring them in for MRIs and stuff and check on the state of their alpaca. And I didn't care about his poster at all. I was like, how often do you see them? Do you like, are they yours? Like,
What are their names?
This week I learned that the first woman ever to rob a stagecoach and live was also the last. Barely spent any time in prison and lived until at least 1955. So this was a really interesting fact for me. One, I'd never, really considered how many female stagecoach robbers there were in the United States. It appears that there were 2 ever, and 1 died.
Okay.
So we don't really have many records. The other was Pearl Hart, which is a great name if you're going to be a famous... Yeah. And I think that maybe just how catchy it is, it really matters in this story, because she is not someone who is hated for her crime, and in fact she gained so much fame from being a female stagecoach robber that it really kind of shielded her from all of the negative side effects that usually come with committing crime. But Pearl was a Canadian girl. She eloped with a pretty awful husband, it seemed, in her late teens. He was abusive, gambling, drunk, whom she left and got back with multiple times. And so she lived this kind of not so great life in Canada, but she watched the Buffalo Bill Wild West show quite a bit, was really enamored with the idea of the American West, and so she convinced her husband to take her to Colorado. So they were riding the train, and she allegedly met this charming piano player, got off the train with him, and left her husband to go riding wherever the train was going. Just so cut him off completely.
Wow. Nice.
And thus started her life as an independent kind of criminal. Would be the right word. So she had a bunch of minor crimes, little things, kind of petty thefts and misleading situations where she would take people's money.
Well, sure, you gotta start small.
Yeah, just the little things. But in Arizona, where she wound up in the late 1890s, she wound up needing a lot of money. And so with a friend, she decided that in order to raise this money, she would rob a stagecoach. Now, very importantly and very significantly, the money that she needed was to go to see her ailing mother, who had become very sick, and that's why she needed it so desperately. The decision to rob a stagecoach was a little bit unusual at that time, actually. You think it would be a almost logical criminal decision, but stagecoaches carried a relatively small amount of money most of the time. It was a dangerous thing to do, and I guess kind of in an ironic turn of events, people had stopped robbing stagecoaches largely because they used to have what was called a shotgunner, someone who would ride along the stagecoach with a shotgun to protect it. And this particular line of stagecoaches in Arizona stopped doing that years before because no one was robbing them anymore. And so Pearl and her friend came upon a stagecoach, robbed them at gunpoint, and collected all $431.
Yeah.
Which is, this is 1899, mind you. So we're not, this is very late frontier era. That's $12,000 modern dollars. And they were on the lam for about 7 days, riding around in the deserts of Arizona, probably with tons of camels everywhere.
One can only hope.
And so she was caught, and newspaper headlines were caught that, the stagecoach robbers were brought in, and one of them was a woman, and it became a media sensation, and she was a star. Cosmopolitan magazine, which apparently did news once, shockingly.
Wow.
Yeah. So the Cosmo ran a piece that said that Hart was, quote, just the opposite of what would be expected of a woman stagecoach robber.
Well,
Which I think is a perplexing line, but I think the insinuation is, well, if you're a robber, you're clearly ugly. But Pearl was not ugly.
Some women can have it all.
Right?
good looks. All the money from a stagecoach. A name like Pearl Hart.
She was kind of a media darling. She was this woman who had robbed a stagecoach at the age of 21, survived, made it away, got caught, was now in prison. She comes to her court appearance, and what amazingly happens is for her and her co-robber, the jury found her not guilty, and they were released with no charges. And the Judge Fletcher M. Doane, was shocked and angered by the jury and scolded them for failure to perform their duty.
Wow.
Because he felt that they had been incorrectly swayed by her heartfelt petition that she was just a poor girl, not from these parts, trying to get back to her ma, and she just needed a little money. Basically, 12 male jurors all swooned and said, like, oh yeah, she's fine. And then also, like, that guy that was with him, her, also fine. And just let them go.
I love this story.
You know what's
great?
One of the things that's really interesting about her crime was that after they took whatever the $431 is, they gave a little bit back to ensure that the people on the stagecoach had enough money for food and to get a hotel the next night. Mm-hmm. And then at the trial, she actually has a pretty famous phrase in the history of feminism, and she said during the trial, quote, "I shall not consent to be tried under a law in which my sex had no voice in making."
Yeah.
This is amazing that a group of 12 men found that argument persuasive.
What's really fascinating is, and so she actually was arrested shortly thereafter on unrelated charges, basically because the judge was so mad that she'd gotten away in the first place that he found anything else to arrest her for. And her partner managed to escape and was never caught. And so he served almost no jail time.
Boot.
The John Boot.
Boot.
Mr. Boot.
I am Boot.
But Hart was in prison for about 2 years, and she had the biggest cell in the prison. She brought to light the fact that most prisons were not equipped to handle women prisoners. They didn't have any resources for them. They didn't have separate spaces or utilities. So she kind of got to stay in one of the better rooms and was very friendly with the guards, for which she needed to ask a lot of favors and kind of have special treatment. And then in 1902, she received a pardon from Arizona Territorial Governor Alexander Brody, which he didn't justify. He just pardoned her. Yeah. And there are all kinds of rumors and allegations about how she curried all this favor with the guards, with the governors, with all the people. But the wardens of the jails really liked her because she would say nice things about their prison when people came to interview her daily.
Huh.
And they would come to take photo shoots, and she would leave the prison and do a photo shoot and come back. And she would say, oh, they treat me so well here. It's a great prison. And so the warden was happy. She was happy. The media was happy. It was just ridiculous situation. Where she's
5 stars, would recommend.
Everybody try it. And so what I find amazing was that she had a lot of time to be introspective about her life and her career. And so she wrote a book about it, and she acted out basically her own character in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which had pretty much inspired her to become a stagecoach robber in the first place. So she picked up an alias and performed with them for a couple of years. Then she ran a cigar store in Kansas City. She was arrested again and then acquitted. So she ran this life kind of in and out of crime, never having to face any real serious jail time. And she lived for another 50 years in Kansas City.
Wow.
Just kind of,
awesome.
On and off the celebrity radar. And I think it's just so cool because she did write a lot of things about her life at that time. And she had this quote that said, about the time leading right up to when she was stagecoach robbing. I was 22 years old. I was good-looking, desperate, discouraged, and ready for anything that might come. I do not care to dwell on this period of my life. And I think for anyone in their 20s, yeah, right on.
Yeah.
I feel that. But just such an interesting person, such a cool story. And one of the few kind of famous female robbers in the history of the U.S., or especially of the frontier period, like pre-Bonnie and Clyde era. There's a short list of other ones, if I could share a few names with you.
Go for it.
Pearl Hart had a fantastic name for being a robber. Not everyone did, so many of them had to get nicknames. One that I particularly liked was Sarah Jane Newman, who was known as Sally Skull.
Oh.
There's another one, Mary Catherine Haroni, who I looked up pictures and I really don't understand why she had the nickname Big Nose Kate.
Oh, man.
Which is just brutal. Then there was another one whose name was Belle Starr. And then this one I think is really cool. Her name was Eleanor Dumont, but she went by the alias Madame Mustache.
Yes.
And
so funny.
Apparently she was part of all of these robberies, and she like painted on like a little, essentially Hitler mustache, and like went into the bank.
I mean, that would be pretty scary.
Yeah.
So some other people I thought had really great names and also really interesting stories were it was two like very, very young girls. They were like in between like 11 and 13 years old.
Oh, wow.
They were like real outlaws, and they stole horses, and they apparently in their Wikipedia pages it said they sold alcohol to Indians, and like apparently I don't know, but they did a bunch of things. Apparently they just kind of hung around with other outlaw gangs, and their names were Cattle Annie and Little Britches.
Wow.
Yeah, and so Cattle Annie was Anna Emmeline McDoulet, I guess. And then Little Britches was Ginny Stevenson. And they were crazy, crazy young. And I think they were apprehended when they were like 12 or 13 years old. Wow. And they were active for about 2 years. And they were out there like mostly on their own. And they're so hardcore. Like they were captured by U.S. Marshals after like a long chase. Cattle Annie was captured trying to climb out of a window to escape by a marshal, and then a different marshal, Bill Tilghman, had a much more difficult time getting Little Britches, who actually engaged in like a fist fight and shot a rifle at both of the marshals. And
oh my goodness.
Yeah. And basically they did not go quietly, and these were like preteen girls. But there was another really famous woman of the Wild West, and that was Laura Bullion, aka the Rose of the Wild Bunch. And so Laura ran with like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, that group of people. And so her father was a Native American who was also a bank robber, and then just sort of being born into that life of crime, she eventually joined their Wild Bunch gang and became known as the Rose of the Wild Bunch. And so she like sold a lot of the stolen goods and made a lot of connections that provided the gang with a steady supply of like horses and other things like that. She periodically was romantically involved with a number of different members on and off. And on certain occasions, she actually dressed up like a man, as you were saying. That was something that happened a lot in sort of the frontier outlaw period. Women who were involved in these kind of like escapades would dress up like men and join with the rest of the gang and like train robberies and stuff. And so in 1901, she was actually finally arrested in St. Louis, and she'd had about $8,500 worth of like stolen banknotes that just she had on her. She was released from prison about 3.5 years later. She retired and then became an interior designer in Memphis, Tennessee. So you said Pearl Hart died in 1955. Mm-hmm. Laura Bullion died in 1961.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And that's crazy. she like robbed trains in the Wild West, and she died in the 60s.
She heard Elvis.
I know, it's amazing. Her gravestone in Memphis has a rose with a bunch of like thorny vines all over it, and actually then under that it reads the Thorny Rose. And she was, of course, the last surviving member of the Wild Bunch, so it's pretty interesting. But anyway, the point is, she had a very long career, mostly as an interior designer in Memphis, Tennessee, and try as hard as I could, I can't find any of her like work. I was really hoping to be able to find some interiors she had designed, but no, I was unable to. But it's just fascinating.
I think the ultimate irony would have been if she had been like consulted specifically with banks, like, oh yeah, well,
yeah.
interior design / security consult.
With this vault, let's go for open concept.
Yeah. These walls seem so thick and oppressive.
Let's knock down this wall here.
Really need to just air the space out, throw open all the windows, So I opted to look into famous stagecoach robbers in general and found the tale of Black Bart, who, in my opinion, as I'm sure you will soon agree, was one of the classiest, at the very least, the most literary of the stagecoach robbers of his time.
So he was a gentleman robber. Could have gone with BYU.
Yeah, actually, he was actually referred to as the gentleman robber by newspapers at the time, so very nice. But essentially, basically the story behind him is he started his robbing career based on a very strong vendetta that he had against Wells Fargo.
Honestly, you know what? That attitude is pretty applicable today as well. Have you met Elizabeth Warren?
He's about to be a very sympathetic character really soon. But essentially, he tried opening up a mine in Montana, and some Wells Fargo reps showed up and tried to buy it from him, and he didn't want to sell it. And the way that mining worked back then, you needed flowing water to actually pan for gold, so they shut off his water and ruined his mind. So he was like, Wells Fargo. And he was this guy who had no history of crime, no experience robbing, which I guess you don't until you start robbing things. But the best part about him was that in reading about him, he does not strike me as your sort of stereotypical kind of gritty, spittoon spitting, like gunslinging robber. For one thing, his trademarks, at least in terms of appearance, so one of his trademarks was that he was always very nicely dressed. So he had a nice coat and a bowler hat, but to look kind of like a criminal would put a flour sack over his head because, you need to have something. And his victims, the people he robbed, reported that he was surprisingly very polite and pleasant to talk to and would joke with them, had kind of a genteel disposition. He never swore and he never actually fired any guns. He was also afraid of horses, so never rode any horses to rob people. He was kind of clever. And actually his first robbery, he tricked the stagecoach driver into thinking that he was sort of driving into a thicket that had other bandits with guns waiting for him to arrive, and he handed over the money, and then upon getting out and investigating saw that all those all of those rifles that seemed to be protruding from the bushes were actually just some sticks that Black Bart had tied together kind of artfully.
That's funny.
But I mentioned earlier that he was literary, and that was because he had a habit of leaving poetry behind at his crime scenes.
Awesome.
Wow.
He only did this twice. But he actually got his moniker by his sign-off for his first poem, in which he identified himself as Black Bart the Poet. So he also had a bit of a taste for wordplay as well. So it was P-O-8, like the poet. But to give you a sample of my favorite of his works, I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor, and for riches. But on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches.
Nice.
So funny.
So that leaves us with just the quiz, which is loosely inspired by this week's theme. I won't tell you the degree of looseness exactly.
Okay.
But I'll leave it to you to figure out over time.
Okay.
Because I think it may become apparent. It's sort of a secret theme to all the questions, but that theme is derived from this week's theme.
Okay.
And that's all I'll say about it.
Okay.
Gotcha.
All right, so question number 1. The three-toed sloth and the dwarf seahorse have the distinction of holding what Guinness record for each of their respective phyla?
So, three-toed sloth. Do we know anything about... Are they the slowest? Is the dwarf... I mean, everything I know about seahorses
How many
is like
toes
the
do
males...
sloths normally have, do you think?
Well, there's
if it's
two-toed
short...
and three-toed. But it can't be most toes because we'd win.
Well, yes. I'm just imagining like the correlation between toe quantity and speed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, seahorses don't have any toes, so it could be the fewest toes. And seahorses are tied with all fish for the fewest toes. Well, but then there's a two-toed sloth, so... Yeah, I mean, so the three-toed sloth, it's slow, it hangs from trees.
Yeah.
Okay, seahorses...
I mean, I guess if they're really tiny, then perhaps it might take them a while to traverse.
That's true. Sort of like relative... Or I know they're like... Distance covered could be Very low, like
Yeah.
lowest distance covered over a lifetime.
I mean, okay. That's probably also true based on the actual Guinness record that they have, which
Okay.
is a much simpler way of saying it. Which is basically something you've already said.
The slowest?
Yes, they are the
Okay.
slowest of their
Interesting.
respective class. So the three-toed sloth is the slowest mammal that we have recorded. It has an average ground speed of about 6 feet per minute.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's when it's really, really going for it. And then seahorses in general have very small pectoral and like side fins, so they don't move very quickly. They can kind of just jut around. And the dwarf one is extremely ineffective at swimming in a forward direction. So they are the slowest members. So that is your answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Question number 2. What eukaryote is approximately 50% protein by volume and an excellent source of niacin and folic acid?
Something that people are like, we eat this to get folic acid and niacin.
It's also something that I had to describe as a eukaryote.
Is it yeast?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
To
Then that would make
be honest,
sense.
Rob, I've never heard anyone say like, you know what? I'm feeling low on niacin and folic acid. Anybody got any yeast?
Looking for a spot of Marmite.
But what I'm saying is you could.
Okay.
Sure.
But yeah, it is.
Okay, so it's yeast.
Yes. Far from the most popular
Source of folic acid.
Yes, but
Okay, so we have their slowest, and then we have a yeast. Okay.
Okay.
We're gonna keep building
I like
up
your
ideas.
process.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, question number 3. What is the alternate name of the Chilean island and World Heritage Site Rapa Nui?
Easter Island.
Yeah, Easter Island. Yeah.
Easter Island, exactly. And so it's a really interesting place, Easter Island. Native Polynesians arrived there around 1200 AD, it's believed, and they crafted those famous large moai heads, which decorate the island. And so it was named Easter Island much later by European settlers.
Okay, we have Easter, probably. Yeast. Slow. Okay.
Okay. Question number 4. What outdoors company is named after, quote, generally the coldest, iciest, and most formidable route to climb?
North Face.
I don't know
Yes,
North Face
it's the North Face.
Okay.
Okay, so now we have North and East, but no South or it's the Wild West.
Is the theme every direction but west?
Well, wait, because just
Okay.
some are easier to
With
work
some other
into.
things sprinkled in.
Yeah. So I'm just saying. But if you look back at all of your answers, do you have
Slow. Slowest, slow. Slower, slowest, slow.
Okay, I was very duplicitous at the beginning, but I'll push ahead because I
Okay.
think you're sniffing on the theme.
Okay.
Also, an interesting thing about the North Face is their curved logo is actually a representation of some rock outcrops and possibly Half Dome in Yosemite.
Oh,
Yeah,
Nice.
It's very similar. Question number 5. What Alfred Hitchcock classic starts with a staged DUI in Glen Cove, Long Island, and ends in the vicinity of Mount Rushmore?
North by Northwest.
North by Northwest.
Directions.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so that was the reveal, I guess.
slow?
So
Slow
West.
West.
Oh, no. Slow West.
okay.
So
Okay.
now you know the
Okay.
jig.
Yeah.
All right.
Now we know it's cardinal directions.
Question number 6. While not actually based on a real person, the main character of what television show is purportedly inspired by individuals named John Rocker and Mitch Wild Thing Williams?
I don't know many
So
shows.
it's a TV show. It's a relatively modern one. And so I think like my short list was there were probably only about 3 or 4 that have directions in them.
Is it Westworld?
It is not Westworld,
Damn!
Oh.
but I
That's a
do
good one,
believe
though.
it's an HBO show.
It's not.
So
It's on the same network.
American, so not EastEnders.
not EastEnders.
Okay.
So it is written by Will Ferrell and Adam McKay. It's a comedy series that only had 29
Oh,
episodes.
Eastbound and Down.
Eastbound and Down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, haven't
In
heard
which
of that.
Danny McBride plays a retired and somewhat ludicrous baseball player.
Okay.
Yeah, so based on 2 real people, both of whom disavow any relation to the show, and Will Ferrell says, yeah, it's not them for real, but they inspire the character.
Okay.
Alright, so it's Eastbound and Down. Okay, question number 7. I'll start this with a little background, because this one took a little working to get to. But so you need to know about something called AutoDIN. AutoDIN is the Automatic Digital Network System, which was a military application for communication developed in the 60s, and it became the precursor to the modern internet. So it was a really reliable service that operated at high availability using mechanical punch cards in order to send and receive data. During peak operation, AutoDIN handled 20 million messages a month. When they tried to update it to AutoDIN 2, it didn't work, and it was replaced by packet switched networks made by a company called BBN, who created ARPANET, which is essentially what led to the modern internet.
Right.
So AutoDIN was right on the cusp of becoming the internet, essentially, technology-wise, and they failed to do so. What company was a primary contractor and user of AutoDIN for United States Communications? And I'll say this one has a tie to our theme kind of more directly than most of the others.
So it's
Westinghouse.
Westinghouse.
Good guess. Not a person's name, though. Sorry.
Looking for a company?
It's a company name.
Okay.
But so this company still exists. They've just transformed what their business is. So they were known for secure transfer of information and money.
Oh, so Wells Fargo?
Not Wells Fargo.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's Western Union.
Yes.
That's what I meant.
Oh.
Yeah.
Ooh, okay.
Western Union.
Western Union,
yeah.
exactly. And Western Union, amazingly, began as a company in 1851 as the New York and Mississippi Valley Printing Telegraph Company, and they served delivering telegrams continuously for 155 years until 2006, when they sent their last telegram.
Wow.
Yeah. At which time, they were still sending about 20,000 telegrams a year.
Wow.
Well, who was still sending telegrams?
You know, just like, Grandpa, happy birthday, stop.
Sends telegram to grandson.
Sounds like probably like Laura
Google to
Bullion.
work. Stop.
And Pearl Hart. Probably like 1955, 1961, we're still sending telegrams.
And question number 8. NFL quarterback Kurt Warner had a 65.1 completion percentage in his 58 games with what modern NFL franchise pertinent to the theme?
Oh,
Cardinals!
Oh.
Hey, we got
Nice.
a sports question.
Sweet.
In Arizona, too.
Yeah.
Where all the camels are.
It all comes together.
Whoa.
And so, interestingly, the word cardinal, as in cardinal directions, comes from the Latin word cardo, which is the street, often the main street of a city that runs from north to south.
Huh.
And so a city would be built around its cardo, and so the directions north and south would be cardinal directions from the street, as would east and west being the kind of perpendicular cardinal directions, which actually has nothing at all to do, it's etymologically, with like the Catholic cardinals or with the bird cardinals named after them.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Very cool. What was the idea behind that you would never be like traveling towards the sun and not have like having the main road be north-south?
It's an interesting question. I don't actually know why that was what they did, but that was like their kind of like city planning 101 was build a big north-south thoroughfare.
So, Emily, in the city that you're designing, you could only go north or south? So it would be like a bunch of parallel roads that aren't connected to each other in any way?
No one talked to each other.
I just mean, why is the main road always north-south?
Well, you can't look at our brethren to the east. It's morning.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Facts Machine, all about the Wild West. I hope you enjoyed all of the wild facts that we dug up for you guys. And if you did enjoy it, please let us know by getting in touch with us on Instagram or Twitter at FactsMachinePod, or find our Facebook page at Facts Machine Podcast. Also, a big shout out to the official composer of the Facts Machine theme song, Anthony Antonelli, and keep a lookout for details about our live show coming up. All right, until next time, goodbye.
Bye.
Question number 6. While not actually based on a real person, the main character of what television show is purported... What?
And I think we broke.
The main character of what television show is purported...